Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 65. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 8 and 9 in the Prima Secundae, that is, of the will in regard to what it wills and of that which moves the will. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether the will is of good only. Do we will evils, or is the will only directed to the good? Aquinas will argue that every faculty is directed to some proper object, like sight to color, the mind to truth, and the will to the good. And since evil is in itself a privation, a nothingness, how could any faculty be directed towards it? And for more on the essence of evil, I'd recommend listening to episode 25 of this podcast. Since the will is the intellectual appetite towards the known good, even though we may choose moral evils like sin or physical evils like pain, we do not will them as evils, as privations, but because either we believe they will lead us to some good, like amputating a limb to save the body, or for the sake of goods annexed to them, like pleasure elicited by some immoral act. Either way, the intellectual appetite, or the will, is directed towards the good only. Article 2, whether volition is of the end only, or also of the means. Is the act of the will directed only to the goal, or also to the means? And as we know from experience, the answer to this question is both. Aquinas says that just like sight extends to all things whatsoever that are in any way colored, so too the act of the will extends not only to the end or goal, but also to the means ordered to that goal, because both fall under the aspect good. One willed for its own sake, the end; the other willed for the sake of attaining the end, which is the means. And as again we know by experience, both can be and are willed by us. Article 3, whether the will is moved by the same act to the end and to the means. The Thomistic principle which bears on this question is that acts are differentiated by their objects. So if the object of the act, or the thing the act is about, is of a different kind, then its respective act must also be different. Think about the difference between the act of seeing and the act of hearing. One apprehends color and the other sound. Color and sound are very clearly different kinds of objects, and so we can distinguish their respective acts. One, the act of sight, and the other, the act of hearing. In the same way, going back to our article, the end and the means, as being different kinds of objects, different kinds of things, therein require distinct acts of the will. The act by which we will a thing simply, for itself, the goal, is one act, and then the act by which we then go on to will the means for the sake of the goal is another act. As Aquinas says, it is evident that the will is moved by one and the same movement to the end as the reason for willing the means, and to the means themselves. But it is another act whereby the will is moved to the end absolutely. For example, when a man first wills to have health, and afterwards, deliberating by what means to be healed, wills to send for the doctor to heal him. The same happens in regard to the intellect. For at first a man understands the principles in themselves, but afterwards he understands them in the conclusions, inasmuch as he assents to the conclusions on account of the principles. So in this way, willing the end simply and for its own sake, and then willing the means for the sake of the end, can be differentiated as distinct acts of the will. And we move on to question 9, of that which moves the will. Article 1, whether the will is moved by the intellect. Absolutely. Nothing can be willed unless it is first known. Similar to how in our sensual nature, our sensitive powers, we don't feel a desire for the donut until we first apprehend it. either with the eyes or in the imagination. So too, in our intellectual powers, we don't will a thing until we first know it. And in general, St. Thomas will say for a power, such as the will, to act, two things are needed. First, the object of the act, determining that faculty to some specific thing, as well as the subject exercising that act, which he explains very simply in the following words. The sight sometimes sees actually, and sometimes sees not. And it sometimes sees white and sometimes black. It needs, therefore, a mover in two respects, as to the exercise or use of the act, and as to the determination of the act. The first of these is on the part of the subject, which is sometimes acting, sometimes not acting, while the other is on the part of the object, by reason of which the act is specified. Article 2, whether the will is moved by the sensitive appetite. Just as the irrational animals like the dog and the rabbit are attracted to sensual goods or have an appetite for the sensed good, so too do we. The difference between us and the dog is that we also apprehend spiritual goods. We desire honor or fame or God's glory, which are simply above the capacity of the sensual appetite. And so we often feel this tension within ourselves between the sensitive and the intellectual appetite. Our article here asks, can our sensual appetite move our intellectual appetite or the will? And as we know by experience, it can via persuasion. Aquinas summarizes his argument in this direction with a chilling phrase from Aristotle, who said, "Accordingly as a man is, so does the end seem to him." So when we perceive sensual goods, they affect us. They elicit a passion in us, whether it be desire or anger or sorrow. And to the extent we are thereby affected or changed, so too is our outlook skewed as to what is fitting or conducive for us to do or to have, so that the desiring man, who in a less impassioned state would not will a certain thing, may now, under the influence of passion, see the same thing as now fitting and desirable, and then be persuaded to will it. St. Thomas takes anger as his example in responding to this article. He writes, "Wherefore, according as man is affected by a passion, something seems to him fitting, which does not seem so when he is not affected. Thus that seems good to a man when angered, which does not seem good when he is calm, and in this way the sensitive appetite moves the will on the part of the object." Article 3, whether the will moves itself. Beginning with Aquinas' words, which we can then elaborate on, he writes, "It is evident that the intellect, through its knowledge of the principle, reduces itself from potentiality to act, as to its knowledge of the conclusions, and thus it moves itself. And in like manner, the will, through its volition of the end, moves itself to will the means. So just as I first apprehend the world via the senses, first the exterior senses, then the interior ones, then abstract knowledge from those senses in order to inform the mind, from this first known truth, then I can work down by reasoning towards other truths, from principles to their appropriate conclusions, in a similar way, in the will, in willing the good proposed to it by the intellect. From here, the will can then go on to will the means by which that end is to be attained, and it is in this way, from willing the end to now willing the appropriate means, that the will can be said to move itself. Article 4, whether the will is moved by an exterior principle. In this article, we receive a commentary in some ways of the previous article. Now, back in the very first article of this question, question 9, we mentioned that the will, as the intellectual appetite, can only will a thing insofar as it is known, that by presenting its object to it, the intellect moves the will as an exterior principle. Then, in the previous article to this one, we said, the will can also move itself by going from willing the end simply for its own sake to then willing the means for the sake of that end. Yet even here, the work of the intellect is required, which is the nuance Aquinas wants to highlight in this present article, through what he calls an act of counsel. In his words, insofar as through willing the end, the will reduces itself to the act of willing the means, now it cannot do this without the aid of counsel. For when a man wills to be healed, he begins to reflect how this can be attained, and through this reflection he comes to the conclusion that he can be healed by a physician, and this he wills. But since he did not always actually will to have health, he must of necessity have begun, through something moving him, to will to be healed. And if the will moved itself to will this, it must of necessity have done this with the aid of counsel, following some previous volition. So either in willing the end or in willing the fitting means to that end, the action of the mind as an external principle is required and involved. Article 5, whether the will is moved by a heavenly body, does the sun and moon move the human will? Pretty simply, the answer to this article is in the negative. But like we discussed when this question was asked in regard to the intellect, anything in our physical environment can affect our spiritual faculties, not directly, but either by making themselves apparent to the senses or by hindering our use of the body. And this because although our spiritual powers are not housed in any bodily organ, but in the soul, at least in this life, they are in many ways dependent upon the body to exercise their proper acts. Article 6 in our last article, whether the will is moved by God alone as an exterior principle. As it is written in Philippians 2, verse 13, God is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. One can prove that God is the cause of man's will naturally and not violently in at least two ways. The first, because the object of the will is good, not any particular good, just good in general, which is in fact what God is by his essence, goodness itself. And since everything else that has some semblance of goodness does so because it in some way resembles him, since everything we will under the aspect of goodness, then in this first way, God is the cause of our willing. In another way, God as our creator moves the will as its unmoved mover, since as we've mentioned before, all change must in some way trace its way to the changeless mover of all things, which is God. Lastly, as a final note in this article, there is an interesting objection raised within it, which is, if man's will is in various ways moved by God, why does man ever choose evil? St. Thomas responds, God moves man's will to the universal object of the will, which is good. And without this universal motion, man cannot will anything, but man determines himself by his reason to will this or that, which is true or apparent good. Nevertheless, sometimes God moves some specially to the willing of something determinate which is good, as in the case of those he moves by grace, as we shall state later on. And that is all for questions 8 and 9 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the will, in regard to what it wills and of that which moves the will. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.